Hello to all the listeners of a Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by the Institute of European Right, a think tank based in Vilnius. In the Right Mind podcast, we discuss various topics spanning from political theory to international affairs. My name is Teodoras Žukas, and I will be guiding this conversation. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce our today's guest, Briano Whitmore'u. Briano Whitmore'u is an assistant professor of practice at the McDowell Center for Global Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, and the host of a Power Vertical podcast. For many years, Briano Whitmore'u worked as a senior Russia analyst at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Brian, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
In the conversation, we'll try to cover a few questions starting from Russia's domestic politics after Putin's elections, going forward to the Western strategy towards Russia and the America's domestic politics in this politically intensive period. Brian, the first question. I know that you are traveling around the Baltic states and other countries in the region for the preparation of a book. What will the book cover? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, the working title is Russian Illusions, Lessons from the Post-Cold War, and the book covers the period from the end of the Cold War, or from the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And what I want to kind of tease out is what we got wrong in that period. And each chapter is structured around a series of lessons that we learned. For example, I have a chapter on imperialism because we made the mistake that thinking that when communism was gone, that was going to be the end of our problems. When the deeper problem wasn't communism, the deeper problem was Russian imperialism, and communism was just a manifestation of that. So that's one lesson. Another lesson we learned is that we didn't recognize the national security threat that kleptocracy and corruption posed. We looked at corruption largely as a problem of governance, when in reality it's a security threat. It's something Russia's weaponized and used as an instrument of statecraft. That should have been evident very, very early on, but it wasn't. It didn't become evident until later. Another lesson is that we prioritized our relationship with Moscow, we meaning the United States and the traditional West, the Western Europe, we prioritized our relationship with Moscow over that of other countries in the region like Lithuania or the other Baltics or Poland or Ukraine. We tended to see these countries through the lens of our relationship with Russia, which was the primary relationship in the region at the time. That was a mistake, and that's a lesson that we learned. There's many others. We believed that globalization was only going to be a force for good, that it was only going to spread liberal ideas, when in reality globalization can spread illiberal ideas, as we've learned in recent years. So I have a chapter criticizing the so-called Washington Consensus. This policy that came into being at the end of the Cold War that stressed privatization, deregulation, liberalization. And this is not a political statement. It's more of a analytical statement. But I contrast that with the consensus that existed in the Western world after the Second World War. After the Second World War, we created a consensus on both sides of the Atlantic that stressed social cohesion, that stressed inclusion, because we understood, or policymakers at that time understood, that in the period before the Second World War, the period between the wars, you had a very deregulated laissez-faire economy, and as a result, we got a lot of disenfranchised parts of publics on both sides of the Atlantic that became, quite frankly, pro-Nazi or pro-communist. They were prey to extremist ideologies. And so after the Second World War, we created this social cohesion, this social consensus. We didn't do that after the Cold War. We created what has now become known as a neoliberal economy, a winner-take-all. And that's not to say that type of economics isn't right in some circumstances. I kind of have a very flexible view of economics. I think sometimes you need more state and sometimes you need less state. The problem was that at the end of the Cold War, in that time period, since the late 70s, what we have come to call neoliberalism, this hyper laissez-faire version of the economy, was dominant, was ascendant. And then the Cold War ends. And there was a mistake in the West, in the United States and elsewhere in the West, that it was this that won the Cold War, right? When actually it wasn't. It was a whole combination. Everything from Roosevelt on the left to Reagan and Thatcher on the right won the Cold War. It was the whole gamut of the Western economic tradition. But we went all in with this neoliberal economics, and that kind of became scripture. And economics isn't religion, right? It became scripture, and as a result, now we are faced with, on both sides of the Atlantic, sections of our population who are disenfranchised, who are losers in this winner-take-all economy, and they are prey to extremist ideologies, whether it's coming from Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, Trump in the United States, or elsewhere. So I have a chapter that focuses on our own domestic politics and the mistakes we made. But that's general. And then I hope to conclude the book with some lessons, some policy recommendations.
I think the book will be very interesting, and all the luck with the work that you will have to do to finish the book. Moving to the most relevant questions, we just had the Putin's election, as it is rightly called in the Western media. We know that Putin received about what is it, 87% of the vote of a so-called vote.
Whatever they wanted, they received.
So, but the serious question, in your view, what are the possible changes in domestic politics of Russia, and will the new red lines be crossed in the war with Ukraine?
Well, I think those are two separate questions. I mean, what I'm watching for in Russian politics now, I mean, Putin has now basically kind of restarted his terms. This is now his first term, I guess, according to the referendum they jammed through in 2020 during COVID. So he can serve this term and one more according to the current constitution, which takes us to 2036. The things I'm watching for right now are signs as to whether or not Putin is thinking about succession at some point. Does he want to put somebody in place to be his successor? I don't think he is, but there's some surefire signs to watch. And the first of those is what happens with the office of the prime minister. If Putin wants to continue having Mishustin, who's kind of a technical prime minister, or if he wants to put a more political prime minister in place. So does Mishustin stay? If he stays, that suggests to me Putin's not looking at succession, not thinking about succession at all. If Mishustin goes, who replaces him? Is it going to be a serious political player? Or is it going to be another technical prime minister? So I'm kind of watching that. I'm watching what happens with the Kremlin administration, because that's probably the most important. Russia doesn't really have institutions, but the most important structure in Russian politics is the Kremlin administration. And I'm keeping an eye on what happens with Mr. Kiriyenko. And see if he continues. Now, Kiriyenko, of course, is a hired hand of Yuri Kovalchuk, the businessman who is very, very close to Putin. Kovalchuk has effectively, for lack of a better term, privatized the presidential administration. He's basically running it, and Kovalchuk is his person. So I want to see if there's any movement there, if that signifies any change in the elite. But I don't expect much change, and I think the way we have to look at Russia is not as kind of a government in the traditional sense, a state in the traditional sense. It's a crime syndicate. that's masquerading as a state. I'm working on an article about this at the moment. It functions like a crime syndicate. It's ruled by a very small cabal of cronies who exercise their power outside the constitutional and institutional structures. It uses corruption as an instrument of statecraft. It has sanctioned kleptocracy. It's prepared to use extrajudicial force, including lethal force, to deal with threats, real and perceived. It seeks to expand territory and control markets. It does everything a crime syndicate does. And the way it's structured is like a crime syndicate. If in the mafia you have a godfather with some underbosses below him and some capos under them, that's effectively how the Russian government structure is. I tell my students that you can learn as much about Russian politics as from my lectures by watching an episode of The Sopranos or watching a season of The Sopranos or watching a film like Goodfellas. And I don't even say that facetiously. They always laugh when I say that, but I say I'm actually serious. You can really learn more from The Sopranos and Goodfellas about the true nature of the Putin regime. It works like a crime syndicate. And so what do we expect from a crime syndicate? We expect the boss to try to stay in power until he's dead. And we expect him to be successful, and it's always a he in a crime syndicate. We expect him to be successful until his underbosses think it's in their interest to try to take him out. But as Mr. Prigozhin learned, if you come at the king, you best not miss, right? To cite another kind of crime drama from U.S. television, The Wire. So I'm not expecting much to change. Now, as far as the war goes, I mean, this is the year where Russia's going to try to make serious territorial gains. That we know. The Ukrainian forces are exhausted. They're out of ammo. They're depleted. Russia's been defending for a year now, and now it's Ukraine's turn to defend. I mean, wars tend to go in these cycles. And what I'm expecting to see this year is Ukraine try to defend. And hopefully they're going to be successful in defending. And then hopefully their Western partners, not least of all my country, the United States, is going to come through with the aid package that Ukraine needs. And then hopefully in 2025 we'll be able to see Ukraine begin to make some serious gains if they can survive, if they can stay intact this year. What I also expect the Ukrainians to continue doing this year, something they're doing very, very well right now, is harassing and disrupting Russian military assets, both in Crimea and in the Black Sea. And they've been extraordinarily successful at this. I think it's one of the most remarkable statistics out of this war is that Ukraine has destroyed 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet. Now, when you think about the fact that Ukraine doesn't even have a navy, and they've been able to do this, is pretty amazing. I mean, they've pretty much pushed the Russian forces back in the Black Sea, and to the point where they're my understanding that they're able to ship grain out of Odessa now. So they're going to continue to be doing that. They're going to continue to disrupt Russian assets or military assets in Crimea. There's going to be continued attacks on Russia, Bryansk and Kursk and other places. But I don't expect any serious Ukrainian gains on the front, quite the opposite. I expect Russia to be making some, I'm hoping, only modest gains this year. And then if we get through this year, then 2025 is the decisive year. If the aid begins to flow, Ukrainian pilots are training on F-16s right now. The first ones are about to come online. That's already in the pipeline. The F-16 is a complicated aircraft. Any pilot will tell you that. And Ukrainian pilots are just about ready. The Ukrainians are very fast learners. This is one of the greatest things about training them, is what military people will tell you, is that they're amazingly fast learners, faster than anybody. They learn things in a matter of weeks that it takes others a matter of months to learn, and they learn things in a matter of months that it takes others a matter of years to learn. So we're lucky that way. And the Ukrainians are also kind of a nation of innovators and tinkerers, right? In a lot of ways, we say they're very good at MacGyvering things. I don't know if that phrase will resonate with your audience. It comes from an American television show from the 1980s called MacGyver, about this guy that would always be jerry-rigging and fixing things to make them like blow things up and do stuff. So the Ukrainians have always been very good at MacGyvering their weapons. The missile, for example, that hit the Moskva, it wasn't one of our Western missiles. It was an old Soviet missile that the Ukrainians MacGyvered. The Ukrainians jerry-rigged it and tinkered with it until it did what they wanted it to do, and it took out Russia's flagship. So this is another thing we can expect to see the Ukrainians doing. But this is going to be a rough year. I mean, I don't think we should be sitting around expecting any big gains. I'd love to see the Ukrainians prove me wrong and surprise us. But
they did a couple of times,
like they did
already.
in the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
But what I'm hoping for is that they lose as little territory as possible this year.
Yeah.
While continuing to harass Russian assets in the Black Sea, continuing to harass Russian assets and disrupt Russian military assets in Crimea. But then what we all hope for is that they get to Melitopol, split those Russian forces in two, and then Crimea is a sitting duck. I've always maintained that it'll be easier to liberate Crimea than to liberate all of Donbass, because Donbass shares a big land border with Russia. So it's easier to resupply. If you cut off the land bridge, and then you have to blow up the actual bridge, the Kerch Bridge. But then Crimea is kind of a sitting duck, and then it becomes what military people call a math problem. Yeah. Right. And so that's way in the future. That's 2025.
But the first point of access that you mentioned is Melitopol, right?
That's what everybody says. I'm not a military strategist, but I listen to military strategists when they talk. And Melitopol we're always, Melitopol, basically to get to the seacoast there, to split those Russian forces, to cut off that land bridge. And then once you do that, then it's pretty much checkmate, right? Because then you can take Crimea. And then once you take Crimea, you remove the main staging area for attacks on Ukraine, right? And so you still have Donbass, and of course you still have Belarus. But if you remove Crimea from the equation, it's my opinion that Ukraine can't be secure without taking Crimea back, even if they get everything else. I get frustrated with these discussions of like, well, everything but Crimea. I'm like, no, everything including Crimea, not just for moral reasons.
But for strategic.
For strategic reasons. Ukraine's not secure if Russia controls Crimea. And that's so I kind of prioritize taking Crimea over taking the rest of Donbass.
The other question is about Western strategy in this upcoming year and both beyond. In your latest article in the National Interest, you talk about the phenomena of hybrid containment. Could you elaborate? What is it?
Well, hybrid containment grows out of me trying to systematize and kind of what Russia's been doing in the former Soviet space since the end of the Soviet Union. And I say they're doing kind of four types of capture, beginning with social capture, which means using disinformation to kind of sway certain parts of populations, playing on compatriot policies, using kind of ethnic Russian populations to stir up trouble, but capturing a portion of another country's society, capturing their hearts and minds, if you will. So that's social capture. And we've seen this in many instances. We saw it in pre-war Donbass. We saw it in pre-annexation Crimea. And we've seen it with Russophone populations everywhere. We see them attempting it in the Baltic states with Russophone populations, rather unsuccessfully, but they're attempting it. This is social capture. Social capture kind of creates the stage for the next kind of move up, and that's elite capture. Right? Elite capture is capturing a portion of another country's political elite, whether it be people, members of parliament, members of the government, people in ministries, parts of the bureaucracy, capturing them. And you do that in a couple ways. Social capture enables it because you can elect that. If you capture part of the society, they can elect pro-Moscow politicians to positions of power. But also you do it through weaponized corruption. Right? Through weaponized corruption, through instrumentalized corruption, through securitized corruption, using the corrupt schemes that flow from the Kremlin and beyond, usually energy schemes, but not exclusively energy schemes. But any energy scheme, any money laundering scheme, people along that chain are going to be making money, a lot of money. And people along that chain are therefore going to have incentives to please Moscow. So this is how you capture an elite, right? So you go from social capture, elite capture, and then the next rung up is state capture, of course. State capture. The only example we have this right, and my Georgian friends would agree with me about this. We have state capture in Georgia, effectively. Bidzina Ivanishvili, I call him a Russian oligarch with a Georgian surname. He effectively made all his money in Russia. I'm not even sure his money is actually his money. I think he's kind of a wallet for Putin. But he effectively, while having no political office, he finances the ruling political party, Georgia Dream, which is effectively, while making pro-Western noises, is effectively pro-Moscow. So there you have state capture. And then when all of these fail, all of these other kinds of capture fail, then you have land capture, which is actually the use of actual kinetic military force. Now, if you note that each level up are using different tools. The social capture is using disinformation. The elite capture and the state capture is using corruption. And then the land capture, of course, is using traditional kinetic military means. So if we're going to devise containment, if we want to kind of take a page out of George Kennan's book and pretend it's 1947, but it's not 1947, it's 2024, the world is different now. If we're going to devise a policy of containment, it can't just be military containment. Right? Military containment was very successful in Europe. But we have to come up with a policy that goes beyond the kind of traditional defense arms of the government, that doesn't just focus on kinetic military activity, but to stop these things before it gets to kinetic military activity. So stopping social capture. How do you do that? Stopping elite capture. How do you do that? Stopping state capture. How do you do that? If you stop it down the road, then it doesn't get to the escalation point of land capture. So I'm arguing, and I'm still working out these policies, but that we have to come up with, and a lot of them are in place, quite frankly. We just haven't thought of them in this kind of systematic way. But we have to come up with policies of, preventing the weaponization of information and the use of the weaponization of ethnic Russian populations. We need, for example, to work with our partners in Eastern Europe in ways to creatively kind of bring those Russophone populations into the mainstream. Now, a lot of you all have done this pretty damn well for yourself. You don't need us to tell you how to do it. The Estonians have done brilliant at this. The Lithuanians have done brilliant at this. But you want to be able to minimize this. You want to be able to counter disinformation. A lot of money is being spent on counter disinformation and Stratcom, but it needs to be done with an eye of what are we trying to prevent? We're trying to prevent social capture. Stopping the weaponization of corruption is going to involve a lot of things. It's going to be painful to a lot of our business communities, right? Because they've gotten really used to all this, making all this easy money. But the way I like to frame this is that corruption's the new communism. Right? The Kremlin's black cash is the new red menace, if you will. And we have to cut this off. This goes back to the thesis of my book. We made these mistakes in the 90s. We believed that capital was politically neutral, that kind of globalized commerce was going to, subsume conflict into cooperation, is going to sublimate conflict into cooperation, and that wasn't the case. In fact, it didn't spread our liberal values. It allowed illiberal states like Russia to spread illiberal values into our societies. So we have to start thinking about what we need, and a lot of this has come into policy since the invasion of Ukraine. For example, I have long been advocating kicking Russia off SWIFT.
Okay.
Before
the war.
2014. 2014. Yeah. I mean, when the little war started, before the war definitely, but after the little war started, because I had to break the war into two phases: the little war 2014 to 2022, and the big war 2022 till now. But from the start of the little war, I was saying, kick them out of SWIFT. Why are we buying and selling Russian sovereign debt? Can somebody, we aren't anymore. But why are we allowing the sale of Russians? I was saying in 2014, we didn't allow the Soviet Union to sell its sovereign debt on our markets. Why are we letting Russia do that? Well, now we have banned Russian sovereign debt. I had long advocated bringing back something called COCOM from the Cold War era. COCOM is the Coordinating Committee for Export Controls, which was basically NATO plus a couple other countries like Japan and Australia, I think, was involved in it. But it was basically forbade the sale of any tech, any high-tech product that could be either A, used for military purposes, or B, used to violate human rights. So it effectively cut Russia out of cut the Soviet Union out of the global technological revolution. And I saw the effects of this the first time I went to the Soviet Union in 1991. And this was the kind of the dawn of the personal computer era in the United States. There was no internet yet or so, but we were just beginning to have personal computers. It was not uncommon for students to have personal computers in the United States. And this was like science fiction to the Russians when I went there, because they still had rotary telephones. And the personal computers were unheard of by individuals. So you saw the effect of this. I saw how far behind us the Soviet Union had fallen technologically, and now they've caught up. Russia has caught up, and they're doing it because they have access to our technology. They're not making this technology. There's no Russian Microsoft or Google or Skype or anything like that. I mean, the Balts are making technology themselves, right? But the Russians aren't doing this. So why are we letting them? Why are we selling them the tech they're using to harm us, right? So I was advocating for this. Now we do have export controls in place. I'd like them to be a bit tougher. The world is a little different now. Back in the Cold War, we were able to cut them off from tech, and they remained cut off. They were trying to smuggle it in. This is one of Vladimir Putin's first assignments when he was with the KGB in Dresden. He was trying to set up smuggling schemes to get blueprints for Western mainframe computers through Dresden, from West Germany into East Germany. But now a lot
he's
of
getting
stuff. They're getting it from China.
Yeah.
They're getting it through third parties. So we have to figure out a way to effectively make this much more effective. We need to crack down on the third party enablers who are helping Russia evade sanctions, and this is going to involve some uncomfortable discussions with some of our friends. Right? Because if you look at, or at least our partners, who is enabling the Russians, I'm looking at you, Turkey. I'm looking at you, Armenia, Kazakhstan, India. Right? These countries are friendly countries to us, but yet they are helping Russia get around the sanctions, and as a result, the sanctions have not hit Russia as hard as they need hit them. I want them to feel what it means to be excluded from the global economy. And we can't, and that's a component of hybrid content. Now, this is an evolving thing. I'm still kind of working this through in my own head, but what it is combining kinetic and non-kinetic methods and applying these where appropriate. Though you fight social capture in one way, and you fight elite capture in another way, and you fight state capture in another way, and you fight land capture in an entirely different way. But that these things all have to be systematic and part of the same policy and complement each other in a kind of a coherent whole. Thus, hybrid. Hybrid refers in the warfare sense refers to the use of kinetic and non-kinetic tools in warfare. Well, this is why hybrid containment is the flip side of hybrid war.
Following up on that coherent whole that you mentioned, regarding current politics in the U.S., we talk a lot about what will happen in November, of course, whether President Trump will be reelected as a president. But I would like to ask about current administration still. What is your take on the current administration's policy and strategy towards Russia? Is the Biden administration has a united strategic approach towards Russia and its war against Ukraine?
What I'll say is what Churchill said about the United States. You know what Churchill said about the United States?
He said a lot of things about it.
But one of my favorite Churchill quotes about the United States, he said, "The Americans always do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted all the other options." And I, as an American, I don't take offense to this. Quite frankly, I think this is absolutely correct. Sometimes the British understand us better than we understand ourselves. The administration now has gotten to the right place, only after it's exhausted all the other options. I think the administration wants to do the right thing. The problem was early on in the administration, there were debates about this. There's part of the administration that wanted to focus on China and that didn't want to saw Russia as a distraction, saw Russia as a sideshow, wanted us to basically create a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. Anybody that knows Russia's not interested in a stable and predictable relationship. They want to sow chaos because it keeps us off balance. So there was that debate early in the administration. There were hopes that, nobody dares use the term reset, right? But
we remember the reset and the button, and the Russian language button. In 2009.
It was it was incorrectly spelled in Russian. It's Perigruska instead of Perizagruska. But they weren't seeking a reset, but they did want the other word I always heard was park the Russian relationship. Anybody that knows Russia doesn't get parked. They want to drive the car, preferably in your lane, from their perspective. So that was there early. That desire was there. It was known publicly. It was not a big secret. We knew this debate was going on. We knew, that the State Department had a much more assertive take on Russia than the National Security Council did, for example. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and that changed it. But that didn't stop the debates in the administration, as far as I understand them. You had a debate now there was no more of this fantasy about a stable and predictable relationship with Russia anymore from certain quarters of the administration, not all. But the debate changed, and there was a fear of escalation. There was a fear that the conflict would metastasize to include NATO, that the conflict could escalate up to the nuclear threshold. Now, the President of the United States is responsible for the security of the United States and, to some degree, much of the world. That's fair enough that the President is worried about nuclear escalation, right? That's his job. But that paralyzed us in helping the Ukrainians because and this goes back to Churchill's quote. The Americans always do the right thing only after they've exhausted the other options. I mean, Ukraine was asking for HIMARS, and we said no, and then later we said yes. And they were asking for ATACMS, and we said no, and later we said yes. And they were asking for F-16s, and we said no, and then we said yes. And it's almost become a kind of a running joke in Washington.
I would bet that the same will happen in Berlin with Taurus missiles.
It's definitely going to happen with that. And all right, so we did the right thing at the end of the day. That's good. Good on us. But imagine if we gave all those weapons to Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. Where would we be now? Right? Where would we be now? This has kind of delayed us. It's cost us time. It's cost the Ukrainians territory. It's cost the Ukrainians lives. So I think these lessons have been learned. I'm seeing a lot more unity coming out of the administration now than I did early on. And I think the administration is doing a good job. I mean, Biden came to office without any illusions about Russia. I mean, we all know the famous George W. Bush meeting with Putin back in 2000 when he said he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul. Do you know what Biden said to Putin the first time he ever met him?
No.
He said, "I'm looking into your eyes and I don't think you have a soul."
He said that personally to him?
Yeah, and you know what Putin said in response?
No.
We panamayam drug drug. We understand each other. So Biden came to office without any illusions about Putin. But politics is politics, and you have different factions in the American foreign policy elite that have different priorities. I understand the Asianists want to focus on China. I get it, right? And China is the longer-term, more serious threat. It's the second largest economy in the world, right? Russia is a short-term threat, but their economy is smaller than the state of Texas, taking nothing away from the state of Texas. But it's not a superpower economy, right? But Russia is a short-term threat, and I think a short-term threat that is like a resentful, weaker, declining power is more dangerous than a confident, rising power. The Chinese feel the time's on their side. They're not in a hurry. They're not interested in disrupting the global order. The global order has been quite good to China, quite frankly. But the Russians, they are resentful and angry, and that makes them dangerous. That makes them dangerous, and that makes it a real, clear and present threat. So I think that China's the longer-term strategic adversary. That's clear, but that doesn't mean they're in the short-term sense of our security right now. It's Russia that's the threat, and I don't even think you can decouple them. I mean, there's kind of a Sino-Russian axis that's going on right now. We can kind of play on the differences, with the differences I just described, because the Chinese aren't always crazy with Russia creating chaos. It's bad for business, right? So, but no, I think the administration is in a very good place on this. Now the problem is not the administration. Now the problem is our Congress. Which is the irony. In the beginning of the administration, we had a good Congress that was ready to give money for Ukraine.
But you had lack of
will. But you had a lack of will in the administration, not to get the money, but in terms of weapons systems. Now we got the administration pretty much unified on what needs to be done here, but Congress has to appropriate the money. We live in a constitutional democratic system in which you can't just spend money without it being duly appropriated by the legislature, right? I'm glad we live in that kind of a system. I don't want to live in a different kind of system, but it's creating problems right now because it's creating problems for reasons that are very peculiar to our American system, because you have a majority in both houses of Congress to provide the supplemental aid package to Ukraine. Votes are there. It passed with, I forget the total in the Senate, but it was over 70 out of 100. And it would pass with a similar type of majority in the House of Representatives. But it's got to get to the floor. It's got to get to the floor. In the House of Representatives, the Speaker is all powerful. The Speaker decides what goes to the floor. And Speaker Johnson, who basically appears to want to just do everything Trump tells him to, is refusing to take this legislation to the floor, even though a clear majority of the House wants to pass this legislation. And if he doesn't bring it to the floor, there's only one way to get it to the floor. And this is where I kind of had to learn a little bit about American parliamentary procedure in recent weeks. But there's something called a discharge petition. And a discharge petition is if a majority of the House of Representatives signs on to the discharge petition. So in this case, it's 218 people. Then the legislation goes to the floor. It overrides the speaker. You can override the speaker with a majority signing a discharge petition, but a majority's got to sign it. Now, all the Democrats are going to sign it. We still got to get a few Republicans on there.
But there are a few Republicans.
There are more than a few.
Yeah.
But are there more than a few that are willing to defy Donald Trump and willing to defy the speaker? That's another question. What you want and how far you're willing to go and who you are willing to piss off to go there are different things. And this is what's being worked out right now.
Yeah.
This is what's being worked out right now. We'll see. I give it a 50-50 chance right now.
50-50.
That's my kind of back of the envelope estimate.
Okay. Brian, thank you very much for a conversation, for this brief but really thrilling conversation.
No, thank you.
It was fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to remind you that you've been listening to the Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by Institute of European Right, a think tank based in Vilnius. Thank you.